You've updated your firmware, you're on 39.39, and you're thinking to yourself, I want to know what Alan Ross Reviews EQ is. Give us your best EQ. It's what you always say to me on Instagram. And if you didn't see my last video, why not? And if you did see my last video where I had no less than, not one, not two, but 3 motion pulse speakers, you'll see they all sound different. There is the problem. So I'm going to do my new Alan Ross EQ because, look, for me, it's just, I quite like that. Some of you, I'm not saying everybody, but some of you think it's quite special. I've had people come on and say, you don't know what you're doing. I can't listen to it with that EQ. It's all good. It's just a matter of taste. However, for those of you who are interested, I've gone back to basics. I've EQ'd this from scratch. I've had to pick a speaker to do it on. I think the middle ground was speaker B. Here is in-person speaker B. And you've already noticed on the table is the JBL Charge5. It's not overpriced. It's unbelievable from JBL. It sounds okay, except it's a bit mono and all. We wish it could be a bit more open. But hey, it's got a woofer and it's got a tweeter. Oh, you've gone bonkers. I know you're sitting at home. It's got a tweeter. It's got a tweeter. You love your tweeters. Why not? Just know, from my personal opinion, it's not about having it. It's not about has it got a separate tweeter. It's about how is it implemented, because they're not going to spend a fortune on a crossover. I know they're active. It's a lot easier to have a decent crossover when it's an active speaker. So what was the point of this video? I absolutely forgotten. Oh yes, it's about EQing. So, gone back to basics. I've EQ'd it from scratch, and here is Alan Ross best settings for 39.39. Just remember, I've got 3 motion pluses and they all sound different. So with this EQ, probably every speaker out there is still going to sound different. But on speaker B, here is speaker B, I found that pretty balanced. The problem, of course, with the motion plus is no deep bass. It doesn't matter what you do with the EQ. You push to maximum that 80 hertz slider. It's still not going to have deep bass. It ain't there. It ain't going to happen. No, no, no. But go motion boom if you need that deeper bass. But I think it's quite nicely balanced now along the rest of the frequency response. We have to push, as you've seen. Look, it's not massive. If it was about level, it would be about there. The 150 hertz slider. But it's there. So we have pushed it. The problem is, it's not that it's lacking. Okay, it's lacking a little bit in the upper bass. When I'm talking about upper bass here, I'm talking about the 150. Now, for me personally, when I measure upper bass, I don't go past 200 hertz. That's, for me, it's past 200 hertz. It's already sounding like lower mids. I've got to decide what sounds like bass. You know, as soon as you say bass, it's got certain connotations to what you're expecting it to sound like. So there's no hard and fast rules to, you know, what are the mids, the low mids, the upper mids, the blah, 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 blah. So the problem here is, it's not just, look, it's there, would be level for 150 hertz, but it's actually a bit sucked out, 200 to 300 hertz. And you're thinking, well, you could push the 300 hertz, but if you push the 300 hertz, it doesn't really balance out the 200 hertz part. It's going to boost too much the rest of it. I have pushed the 300. You will see it's all balanced around the 1 kilohertz. By the way, 1 kilohertz just happens to be where our ears are most in line with what we're hearing. Equal loudness curves, if you are aware or if you're going to look them up, you'll see that we have a different sensitivity all along the frequency range. And it all balances around that 1 kilohertz mark. When people normalize, sometimes I normalize to some people normalize to the 1 kilohertz. There's massive problems with that, but it's very significant, the 1 kilohertz mark, where what we hear is in line with what we measure. And I'm just a smidgen over the 1 kilohertz. I mentioned that. I can waffle on because this is all about Alan Ross EQ on the Motion Plus. The point being, people will say, well, you've pushed everything. Why don't you just bring them down, and then relative to the 80 hertz, that'll make the 80 hertz sound deeper, which makes sense. The problem is, this is not parametric equalization. So I don't have unlimited filters that I can add. Unlimited in the width, unlimited on where the band is. We have rigid bands, and between those bands, it's not flat. If you bring everything, by the way, 0000 is bass up mode. Default mode, which is bass up mode on the Motion Plus, is custom mode. Everything's set to 0. If I bring everything down, it doesn't even out. So it doesn't work. You can't do that because you're leaving peaks elsewhere. So bringing all the sliders down does not bring all the frequency response down. It brings certain ranges down. So you can't do that. That sounds quite flat, other than we don't have the deep bass. Of course, we know it doesn't have the same sound every frequency response. So I have to EQ that. You know, I'm going for one EQ for all volumes. I have to EQ that to a certain volume. I EQ that to about 60. Well, I do EQ that to 66%. For me, that's a trade-off between the low volume and the high volume, and works quite well as a trade-off when you're going through the volumes. Of course, for you, you can tailor that. It's going to sound more bass heavy at lower volumes. It's going to sound less bass heavy high volumes. We know it limits about 80%, so you can tailor it. But I have a rule: one EQ, all volumes. Of course, I have broken my own golden rule for the Motion Plus, because you do have to push that 150 hertz, but you will get massive distortion at maximum volume. So at maximum volume, I don't normally bring down that 150 hertz slider, but I will stick to my rule in this particular video. I am going to compare that EQ with the JBL Charge5, a decent old speaker. There's more JBL fanboys out there than for any other brand. And so, let's, without further ado, compare these two speakers. I've given you the background to the EQ and where we are and how I got there. 66% JBL Charge5 with its fantastic logo. You push it to the side, it goes red. We could do that all night. Just remember, mono, 2 passive radiators, 1 woofer, 1 tweeter, 2 tweeters, 2 woofers. Passive, passive. So the setup is slightly different. What do they sound like compared to each other? 66%.
Different like a toy. See you dancing, tell call you me and more. Know you gave it all, but now you need to give me more. Fasten, don't you have my window tinted out the Ford. But before you know it, gonna pick up 3 or 4. They can hear me rolling from the city to the shore. And to wear a mask to keep my face clean from the blood and gore. Don't need the lights on, don't need a tray. The moon it shines on, shine on my wrist. I'm gonna take it, I need a tree. Decapitated, love like the reaper. Don't need the lights on, don't need a tree. The moon it shines on, shine on my wrist. I'm gonna take it, I need a tree. Decapitated, love like the reaper. Don't need to get arrested, tested for me, good to know. The demons at the plane and they're trying to catch a soul. Feeding on a skeleton and soon you see the crows. Yeah, they feeding on. We gon' driving that Tesla, called the silent killer like I'm a Elon. Driving to Mexico, living the ethical like I'm a Philo. Wearing that mask and apparel, we scary, Dia de las Muertos. Rum lemonade, loving the shade. Don't need the lights on, don't need a tray. The moon it shines on, shine on my wrist. I'm gonna take it, I need a tree. Decapitated, love like the reaper. Don't need the lights on, don't need a tray. Decapitated, love like the reaper.
65% volume. The differences are pretty clear here. Mid to deep bass, the JBL Charge5 absolutely dominating over the Motion Plus, which has a lack of deep bass. You can see how it's plateaued. There is no peak when we go mid to deep bass, but what we do have is the ability to push the upper bass. So there's a significant increase in the upper bass over the JBL Charge5. It is a boost. It is way more than you're getting in the original track. But if you don't push the 150 hertz slider, what you'll find is the very upper bass, so 150 hertz plus to say 300 hertz, will become recessed. So while pushing that upper bass does give us an unnatural upper bass peak, it's filling out areas that would otherwise be recessed. So overall, I think it's a necessary boost. Compared to the Motion Plus, the JBL Charge5 is a little bit recessed in the mids, but it does have the brighter high end, but it's not completely natural. There is a peak you can see quite clearly here, just above 7 kilohertz. It's in the region where it's going to start sounding a little bit sibilant, and because there's actually a little bit of a dip at the same point on the Motion Plus, that difference becomes even more obvious. So at the end of the day, there is more bass on the JBL Charge5. It dominates mid and deep bass, but we can compensate to some degree by pushing the upper bass on the Motion Plus. Overlaying the original track to JBL Charge5, you can see it's not completely accurate, with the overall slant being upwards towards the bright end. So recessed mids, a brighter high end, giving you a brighter sound, but it's doing a pretty good job, given the size of the speaker, for reproducing the original bass of the original track. The Motion Plus, overall, it's more accurate. It follows the original track to a greater degree. It's just where you get these little peaks and dips, mostly in that presence range, where things veer away from accuracy. But if you try and pull down those peaks, the problem is the dips go below where you'd want them anyway, so there's a balance to be made. You cannot get this an even frequency response in this region by using the Soundcore app, simply because you're limited to the bands you can equalize, and there's inherent peaks and dips in that region anyway on the Motion Plus. It's at that 180 hertz and below point where we get that big necessary upper bass peak, because if you pull down that 150 hertz, you're going to pull down the rest of the upper bass with it. You cannot balance it out using the 300 hertz slider, and you're going to have to just suck it up. Basically, you're not going to get any deep bass, and the mid bass is very subdued. The JBL Charge5 overall has a bright sound signature. They do push it 5 to 10 kilohertz, and that means it can have a tendency to sound a bit more sibilant. That's the s sounds that can be overemphasized if you're pushing that particular region. It's brighter than neutral, whereas I think that's quite neutral now for the Soundcore Motion Plus. I do quite like that. Just that obvious lack of deep bass, and we do get some deeper bass on the JBL Charge5. So there are big differences and pluses and minuses to each of these speakers. That's obviously mono and quite closed in sounding, almost compressed sounding, but it has a nice bass and it's quite a safe sound. It's not neutral, but it's not that far off neutral that it's a problem. It's on the brighter side of neutral, but not overly bright. And that now, with this particular EQ, I think personally, it is quite neutral. You can delve in, you can have an analytical listen with the Motion Plus, where you can't do that. So it's open, it's sparkly, and you can pick out details, and it has a wider soundstage than the JBL Charge5, but it can't match the bass of the JBL Charge5. So your pacing money takes a choice. It's going to be, what genres do you listen to? What's your personal taste? But for me, I think that's more of the, I'm an audiophile. Obviously, audiophiles, truly speaking, would be spending way more money than... That's what always gets me. People say, well, I'm a bit of an audiophile. What are your Bluetooth speakers sounds good with classical music? Well, none of them. They're Bluetooth speakers. What are you expecting? Go and get a proper hi-fi system. Let's be realistic what these speakers can deliver. But if you verge on the end of saying, well, I'm a bit more audiophile, I like an analytical listener, I like to delve into my music, you're going to go for the Motion Plus. And if you just say, I want a bit of a party, I want to travel, look at that form factor, it's going to take more knocks than the Motion Plus, and two of them, well, you still get stereo and all blah, blah, then the Charge5 has a place. With some genres, it will sound a bit safer. Whereas that's going to, when you have very revealing equipment, bad recordings are going to sound bad. Whereas that's going to be a safer option. And if you've got no idea what I'm talking about, then you probably will want the JBL Charge5. But if you know what I'm talking about, then you'll probably go for the Motion Plus. What about maximum volume? What wallop can we get for our money?
Let noche se prepara pa' cenar caliente, pa' ponernos indecentes. Pa' ese plato tú tienes el ingrediente. Ven y te digo que se siente mal. Cuando me bailes tú me pones high. No uses Gucci, ya prefieres Nike. Te quiero pero con poquita light, 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 light. Díganle al DJ que le ponga más, o que se ponga a sudar. Pa' pasarla bien, ella se porta mal cuando suena el Paka, Paka. Díganle al DJ que le ponga más, o que se ponga a sudar. Pa' pasarla bien, ella se porta mal cuando suena el Paka, Paka. Ese blue jean, rompe la disco con su flow de Medellín. Y está soltera así como me gusta a mí, pa' bailarme así. Rompe cadera cuando se pone salvaje, moviendo sexy todo ese equipaje. La pista se pone territorio de alto voltaje, pa' rimarse hay que llenarse de coraje. Te estoy velando desde hace horas, y aquí no te vas sola. Mami, tu flow de barrio está de moda, y yo te quiero toda.
Maximum volume. The Motion Plus does go louder. You can see where it's getting its loudness. It's really in the upper bass and the mids. The bass now is in line with the Charge 5. But because the mids are still stronger, the overall balance is going to sound a little bit harsher, a little bit more peaky compared to the Charge 5. But ultimately, you can get more out of the Motion Plus. And in terms of the peaks, nearly 3 decibels more. Again, if you overlay the original track, the Charge 5 has a slant towards the bright end, so it's never going to be quite in line with the original track. The Motion Plus does a better job of aligning with the original track, but it simply cannot reproduce mid and deep bass, which of course is reducing now we are at maximum volume. So it's not really about the Motion Plus versus the JBL Charge 5. I'm not going to go into the specs. This is about my EQ. I think the EQ is quite nice. With that EQ, it's going to go considerably louder than the JBL Charge 5. It's going to have more bass, but it's going to sound a little bit more screechy. That still sounds more balanced in terms of being friendly to your ears, where you're going to get, it's going to be a little bit harder on the ears, but not overly so, depending on what kind of music you're listening to. Of course, you can bring that 150 hertz slider down. It's going to get rid of some of that hard edge, but it's going to, look, there's massive headroom here. I think it's more balanced overall anyway. And if you really want to go loud, it's going to go louder. The real difference between these speakers are form factors and whether you prefer, if you need that deeper bass, you're going to go JBL Charge 5, or if you can do without the deeper bass and you like an analytical listen, if you like to hear your details in a more accurate soundstage with that particular EQ, on this particular speaker, as I said, could sound very different on your own version. I've got 3 Motion Pluses. All of them sound different. You're going to have to make a decision. But this is about my EQ. There is my EQ for my speaker B. I hope it translates to your speaker. You'll let me know. Just remember, if you do go maximum volumes, bring that 150 hertz slider down. It's going to be a slightly better listen. It's going to take care of most of that distortion. And that really is, if you're talking about messing with this, if you're going to mess with the EQ, probably in terms of the clarity, if it's a bit harsh, I don't think it's harsh with this EQ, but if you find it harsh, I think 5 kilohertz is a slider to play with. And if you've got a problem with the upper bass, of course, 150 hertz is the slider to play with. Oh, that's been my EQ. Before you ask me again, what's your best EQ settings? There is no best EQ settings. These are the settings I'm quite happy with. Don't claim they are magic or anything like that. I don't claim everything is overpriced, but listen to my EQ and you'll be happy, blah, blah, blah. I don't even have a Patreon where I give you those secrets away. I give you this for free because I'm bonkers. Hope you got something out of this particular video. Hope to see you in another video, and I hope you like my EQ.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, guess I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.